Hello again. We are now working on Chapter 3 in our textbook. And the topic for this chapter is views. And we have already talked about it, at least in principle, because basically anytime we're working with ASP.NET MVC stuff, ultimately you have to generate a view no matter what's going on in the back end. Users want to know either that something's happening or they want to see a result of what they're doing. And that's really kind of one of the first most important concepts here is the fact that, whatever you're doing on the web, you can't just leave a blank screen. Even if there's like back-end processing going on, you need to have the user be at least somewhat aware that something's happening. People want interaction, long and short of it. The author does remind us here that source code for this book, including all these exercises, are available at the publisher's website. And the point there isn't that you just take the application and run it from there. Really, you want to go through the process of building these things and interacting with the tools. But just in case, you can follow the URL that the author indicates here to get not only the resources for the actual code for this exercise, but a bunch of other things. And for my students here at Gateway Technical College, I do want to make you guys aware of the fact that on the resources page, I have included the source code from the author right here in the form of a download that you can just pull in. So you don't actually have to go to the publisher's website. Now, if you do happen to go to the website, then you'll actually find a bunch of other resources as well. So you kind of have to dig in here to find the actual title, and we're using the Professional ASP MVC 5. And one thing you'll also notice is that there is a listing for the errata, a download, and more importantly, there's actually a forum that I know that in the past, when I was teaching this to our SharePoint cohort a couple of years back, using the earlier version of the textbook, we actually found some solutions to some of the problems that we were encountering in the forums, even more so than going to Stack Overflow. So we're not the only ones that have built this music store. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's go back over to the book then and move on to some actual materials. And really, views, let's just sum it up to the fact that that's what we're pushing to the screen. What the person actually sees on the far end. And yes, when we are generating views, we still can apply all the stuff that we've learned about HTML, CSS, JavaScript, any of the libraries. If you want to jQuery it, or you want to put Bootstrap in there, or which is already included, of course, but any of the other libraries, you can throw it in and make the user interface look any way you want. That you will not be limited by that. However, there are some things that are a little bit different here, and we're actually going to start learning this new syntax, folks. And we're going to see this little symbol and learn about a new file extension more formally than the little preview I gave you guys the week preceding. And that file extension is actually this that Css Html file. And now, in short, what this does is it allows us to generate a format for generating the view, kind of like a template of sorts. And in some cases, we'll use the same template to generate multiple things, and the difference will be the stuff we push into the template. And in some cases, we'll have unique templates or view files for everything that we do. It just depends on what the action is. It's really kind of dictated by whatever structure your application is taking. So they do want us to take a look at the index Css Html file, which already exists within the project. And I think what I'll do here is I'll actually get rid of that side panel so we can see it a little bit larger. And I do want you to notice a couple things that are unique here. I mean, you do see below the first few lines that there is regular old HTML in the mix here, mostly in the forms of divs with classes and IDs and whatnot, and regular old HTML tags. And we generated the original version of this site by just clicking a button, and a lot of the content was pre-generated with it. And this is the content that you see. Of course, you can change all this stuff. But I think real important here at the top is this little snippet. Notice the use of the @ sign, then inserted within curly brackets. Once again, we're seeing this view bag thing, .title, and homepage. And you can probably guess what that's going to do, right? And I'm hoping that you guys have done enough coding in this environment in both web and .NET that you're realizing that, well, this is going to be the title for the page that's going to get pushed in. And right now it's a static string, right? Could that also be turned into something dynamic? Absolutely, right? So you could make that a variable that responds to other things you're doing on the screen. So if you're using the same, basic view for multiple pages, some of this stuff can turn into dynamic content. And like I said, a lot of this stuff is per the boilerplate HTML here. So really, when it comes down to how is it all that much different, aside from that view bag thing at the top, it's still HTML. Right? You can go into Visual Studio and find that actual file and see that it looks basically like what I have up on the screen here. That's correct. So the question is, if you were building a site from scratch and you're working on your home page, this is where that would go. Exactly, Jason. That is exactly correct. Now, there is, of course, we're working with all the Bootstrap stuff here, so a lot of the stuff that you see here, so those of you that have worked with Bootstrap before, which is kind of its own field of study, not really the point of this class, but you throw in these class declarations here, and then we use this pre-built CSS library that generates certain column layouts and positions and styles and typography. And by knowing which classes to call, you can apply different looks to it with a minimum of code. So you write really clean HTML, you change your class declarations, and that makes Bootstrap react. And that is kind of a nice and wonderful feature. All right. The thing that we do want to point out, and I'm looking at the book here and kind of scrolling through, so I apologize for like up and down scrolling, but we already learned about what the action result does and how you pull back messages. We've toyed with this a little bit. But let's go to Visual Studio and just make sure that you can find these files. And I do want you guys to understand that the initial ones that are created, so the 3 pages that we basically have that are kind of like normal-ish pages, the home, about, and contact, yes, those views are pre-generated. Each one of them has their own Css Html file. And you can click on them and notice that it is a combination of both HTML and these weird little, @ symbols and view bags and stuff. Really, where it's showing you that this stuff becomes dynamic to a certain point. Notice the contact page, and of course the index page, which is going to look a lot like what we see. Isn't that interesting? If you guys have worked with Bootstrap before, you'll recognize Jumbotron, and that's like the big box that's at the top of like a home page that a lot of websites do. Now, did you guys notice the little message that just popped up on my screen? It says, based on your project, we have identified extensions you may find helpful. Should I take a look? Yeah, let's take a look. Bootstrap Snippet Pack and Glyph Friend. Well, right now I'm going to hold, but if I wanted to add those, you can. And where's the Bootstrap pulling in? That would be on Well, yeah, the Bootstrap is, but what I think what Jason's trying to figure out is what, because you're thinking like master page, or where's my master page, right?
Right. Where. I mean, I see where Bootstrap says, right?
So kind of the answer to that is really finding the right component. So we're kind of jumping ahead here a little bit in the stream, but actually it's okay because it's a question. If you have the question, we should answer it. So it is in the views folder, but you're going to notice that the file that I'm on right now, you clearly see your doc type and all the regular stuff that you put in the HTML file.
Yeah.
And so it kind of serves as a master page, but it's not really a master page. Whenever you see one of these files and it has an underscore in front of it, we call it a partial.
Right.
So it's part of a page. Right? In this case, clearly the top part of the page, right? And you'll see that there's a bunch of different little @ signs in here. And it really has a whole structure. And it has spots that will pull in certain components. But we're still not seeing Bootstrap, right? Oh, yeah, we do. Okay, at the bottom. And then somehow, when it comes out in the browser, it all sits in the right spot. Well, let's not worry about how that all happens right now because we're still learning the basics of views. But that's okay that we take a little detour. All right, let's go back over to the book. And what we do want to do is basically what the author is asking is that we go through and we look at the structure of what's happening and what's ending up on the screen. Now we can do that by actually running it, looking at our code in Visual Studio, but he's got it here in the book, so let's just do it right here. And I'm actually going to narrow this up a little bit just so that I can get more on the screen. And so what he's going to show us here is that the little part up at the top where it says view bag title about, well, clearly that's going right here, right? Maybe? Or is that up here? Yeah, I would say it's up there too. Because now if you look at the H2 and H3, you can pretty safely extrapolate that this is probably an H2, that's probably an H3. And once again, the H2 is pulling in the view bag and the title, but now it's just putting it into the HTML format, where clearly this part of it is going into some other structure. It's being inserted into the head of the document. And then we also have the message being pulled in. So the thing that we're really showing here is the correlation between the structure of the view file and the output that's coming to the screen. All right, moving on to the next section here, he starts talking about the conventions. Remember, convention over configuration, folks, one of the mottos of MVC. And he's showing us kind of the folder structure in the project template and how some pieces are separated into own folders. And we already discovered that, that the other file that we were looking for is in the shared area because all the pages need to be inserted into that partial. And it also shows you kind of a little bit of a different approach. Like if you are trying to make this correlation to like PHP, for example, right? Or traditional ASP where we're doing a master page and we're inserting content into certain areas like includes in PHP. Here we're using partials in place of that with all the razor syntax, that's what the @ signs are, to pull those pieces in. So kind of the same approach, but a different structure. All right. Now, one thing that happens, and he's pointing out in this section, and can you imagine if we were trying to pull in the index page and then we have to like come up with URLs that look really complex like this, and really we're not really pulling up the Css Html, we're pulling up rendered content. And what the point here is that you can kind of override some of these things to tell it not to follow these patterns, and he shows you the technique for doing so. I'm not very concerned about this in terms of explanation at this point because I think doing it will help you more than talking about it. But we are now talking about this other thing called strongly typed views, and this is kind of one of these interesting gray areas for me in terms of like how they present the content. So this whole concept of the view bag, and can I just say on the record here, I'm not really crazy about why they came up with that name, view bag, but you know that is what it is. But he's trying to point out here that view bag does have some shortcomings. Okay, and what he is trying to show us here is we need somehow to take the information that we're going to pull in and find a way to get all that information up on the screen. And a view bag might actually not be the best approach in terms of putting stuff in a loop. So if we have like a list of albums, we can pull in traditional C# code, write a loop, and then get each thing to display basically from an array or a list or array list or whatever, which is what he's doing here. And then after we go one by one and we add each product, then we can output it back to the screen. That's kind of the thinking, the approach. Instead, using the razor syntax, and this is really kind of why the razor syntax exists once you see this, is we're going to change to a different type of approach because this allows us to actually interject code directly into our HTML as opposed to write C# code, which fills a variable that we then pull into the HTML page. So you see the difference here? Here we're working straight in the HTML, and we're using that razor syntax. It is a special syntax, and we're learning it, right? And then what we're doing is we're running a for each, which is going to traverse our data structure, pull in for every record, pull in all the information, and insert it into the view bag directly. And then I'm not sure if you guys have learned about this as a data structure or not, but whenever you see an array, you usually see what? Square brackets, right? But when you work with an array list, then you see regular brackets, like HTML style brackets, indicating a different type of structure. They kind of work the same way, but they have some different functionalities. In addition, there's this thing where we can take things and make them enumerable. And what it means to enumerate something is to basically number it. So it's kind of like a numbered list, if you want to think of it that way. All right. So now, by combining these approaches, we have this really simplistic for each loop, really, done in one statement, and then taking that and inserting content directly into a view with a list item that will happen dynamically over and over again until the whole structure is built. Now, I mean, it's not really that much less code, but the fact that we're doing it not in an external class file, but really bringing it into the HTML is kind of an interesting thing. Okay. You can get even more clever and boil it down even a little bit further. And there's different approaches. And like I said, I was always curious as I'm moving into this new book how they're changing the approaches, and now I'm starting to see them. And I'm very thankful because we're not using the old MVC3 approach. We're using the more modern approach, which is much better. All right, as we progress here, we're also going to ramp it up to another level, and that's what he's trying to indicate here, is that if we have a list of information as a data source, right? And in this case, at least in the old version of the book, they used the C# file to feed in a lot of the data, if I remember right. We are actually going to pull in information, and once again, we're using the Enumerable thing, and notice what's sitting in front of it now. And we haven't talked about models yet, but what we're doing is we're using one of the data structures that's built into Visual Studio to actually feed data and create a model out of it. In other words, the M of the MVC, and that's the part that we're going to be pulling from over and over again. So this is an interesting approach because now that will sit in a simplified method. So in other words, instead of doing all the work inside the for each loop, we're doing that separately, generating a data model, and then just feeding the model into the loop itself. So kind of notching it up one step. Now in order to do that, we do need to make sure that we pull that stuff in. So ultimately, if you are going to work with that, then it becomes a resource that we've created, which is the data model, that we can then pull into any page we need. So instead of pulling in a system library, we are now pulling in our own. Okay, so that, I mean, a little long-winded to get there, but that's the point. Another thing that's going to happen is we're going to start working with what we call namespaces, and very often when we're working with namespaces, you're using system-generated ones like the ones you see here, but because we're going to be working with our own, notice that we also have a statement like that, which pulls in our very own. All right. Now I was going to start to break down some information here and talk about some of these different concepts in terms of what a view bag is, view data, and view data dictionary. And let's take a look first at view data. And notice some of the descriptions he puts in here. It says, all data is passed from the controllers to the view via the view data dictionary, which is a certain class that's created. And you can set and read values using standard dictionary syntax. So notice the use of the square brackets here. Compare to working with the view bag. And notice the technology here. We're really going back to ASP MVC3. Now, always remember that this application was originally coded in that format, and there are conversions that are happening. So that's an important thing. So point is, this is equivalent to that. Okay, so if you're following the old tutorials, sometimes you'd have to stumble if you were making it a comparison there. All right. Since we're going to be pulling in data, we're now going to start contending with models. And once we have kind of created our own data model based on our information, and then we're going to start pulling it in, we're actually going to use it as our own library. It's going to become a pretty common thing to do. So we're going to start using some of that data to create other data structures, kind of like we did in ASP.NET when we would pull in a database, read information from a table, and then that table then became like a drop-down menu that we could select from, and then we would select from that menu and it would post back automatically. And so we're kind of doing that stuff, but instead of pulling from necessarily a database, we're pulling from a data model, which is built on data that we're feeding. Okay, so just to get you that concept. Moving on here, we're now going to go into this next section and show how to actually add a view. So you are going to get to the point where we're going to be doing the step-by-step, which I think is coming up real shortly, but he's doing overview. I just want to make sure of that, so sorry for the scrolling. Usually I pause when I do that, because I know people watching the video are like, what's that? What's that? But once again, you are going to, and notice here that inside of a code view within Visual Studio, you will actually be able to right-click right inside the code and add a view directly from that position, which is kind of interesting. Right, so you're going to have that capability, and then you're going to get interface that's going to ask you a few different questions which are detailed here in the bullets, and then you'll get used to these interfaces as you're working with them. So you're going to be doing this, and you're going to be populating these screens. So what are you going to call your view? What template are you using? Are you using a template even, or are you, doing something? And obviously you're going to have choices where it's empty, or it's empty with a data model, or with a template with a data model, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to have various options. And then as the application becomes more robust, there will be times where we are going to pull to be creating, views that are partials that we've created, or leverage ones that are already present, and that interface allows you to basically access all of those things. And what I'm trying to figure out here, he's not actually asking us to do this at this point, I'm hoping, because I don't see the step-by-step. You guys concur, I hope. All right. Ultimately, we will have to deal with some of the scaffolding, which we talked about before. And remember, the scaffolding is a way for us to basically very quickly put together a framework to do a bunch of different things. Notice right off the bat, basic CRUD operations are right at the top, create, delete, view, edit, etc. And then also you will have Jason, this is the thing that we were just looking at. So he did actually get to talking about it. Where are we pulling in all our external libraries? And basically, they're going into that file. So we kind of covered that indirectly. So your question was right on target. He just took a little while to get there. All right. So let's get to talking about Razor. And Razor really is a pretty important part of MVC, as you guys are discovering, because it is really kind of that insertion tool for creating views. All right, so Razor does stem back to MVC3, and that one of the reasons they put this tutorial together in the first place is to demonstrate how Razor works. And what they're showing you here is it says that this symbol basically indicates you're working with Razor syntax. The thing that you'll notice within Visual Studio is anytime you're working with that, you'll always have these yellow highlights directly in the code, and that's so that you don't miss the fact that you're working with it, because you are interspersing it with that HTML. You don't want to get it confused. Yeah, and I like that. Don't overthink it. Sometimes just do it is a good way. There are expressions that will happen within Razor. You guys learned that when we were doing traditional ASP.NET that you use the ASP tags to insert content. Razor kind of works the same way, but it depends on if it's standalone or if it's actually inserted in HTML tags. You won't see the curly brackets. You'll see just the @ sign. Okay, not really too much more there to worry about in terms of content. All right, we did also talk about this HTML encoding thing already, and that little method that we included beforehand to make sure that people aren't injecting stuff. But if people can drop in a script tag like this, yes, you can hack your own application. But if we use those libraries, that will prevent that. Not much more to say on that for right now. If we do run into the situation with Razor where we are writing blocks of code, like what they're demonstrating here, curly brackets are used. And notice that even though we're using the curly brackets, you can still drop HTML stuff in between it. That's how the technology works. So for us web people, that's a little more comfortable than using some of the maybe older ASP approaches. All right, and moving on. All right, different types of Razor expressions. The difference between implicit and explicit, where explicit will tell you very particularly that this is what you're doing in terms of having that @ sign in front of it, where this is implied. It really is based upon whatever is in this other data structure that we're not really seeing right now, where when we explicitly do it, it's like a literal versus an abstract, folks. All right. Now, really what they're doing here is they're showing you all the different syntax for Razor. What I prefer that you guys do is really take your time and read this on your own rather than me demonstrate it. We'll see it in action, and then if you need to fix something, of course, you'll figure it out. But please notice that there are syntax rules for Razor, and yes, there's entire books on it. We have things that we have to do, escapes for characters if necessary. And then if you want to do, this is kind of interesting, a server-side comment. Notice the commenting approach here, which is at star at, right? Yeah, a little bit. But it is its own syntax. All right. Let's start getting into layouts now, and then this is where we start to see Razor kind of leveraged a lot. So we are setting up basic HTML documents. So we were looking at that layout document. We do see that there are Razor components here that are intended to be dynamic. So they will, whatever your page is, it's going to read your code from the page that's being assembled and then insert into these spots. So I don't think that that's going to be too difficult. Notice that, yes, there are ways to insert stuff into the body. And notice the command, render body. And you'll get used to these as we go along. All right. So as you move on, what they're attempting to show you here is that what it looks like in the aftermath after you run your code. So what the code we saw above will look like this after it's run. And yes, you can render the body, and they also have rendering tools for sections and based upon whatever the ID of the section is or whatever we're calling it. All right. Notice the Razor syntax here and how that all assembles. And once again, I trust that you guys can read this without me reading it to you, so that's why I'm going kind of quickly through it. All right. In this little block here, and maybe I've mentioned it a couple of times, but when MVC 3 started, the way that they would lay out the application and the folders and where you would put things looks a little bit different than it does in versions 4 and 5. So the point of this is really that it has morphed over time. And if you do go back to the original tutorial and start looking at those examples, please be mindful of that things are located in different spots. All right, next section here, bottom of page 72, we're looking at view start. And this is actually a tool that we're going to use to help work with some of the partials that are going on. Notice that we can actually specify the use of a partial view by using some pretty simple syntax. And notice that there's actually a way to declare it and push it through. Remember, partial views are really helpful because there are times when you do repeat certain components in views, and I like to think of it as the equivalent of doing an include in PHP or using master pages, excuse me, to a point with some different types of functionality to it because of the way that Razor works in general. All right. The thing that's going to be interesting is, I don't know if you guys are noticing what it says right here, but it does want us to actually do this thing. And it says to see the examples of specifying views and partial views described, you can actually, I'm not going to do it, I'm just telling you that right now. You can actually run the command line, or actually you can use NuGet too, to pull in this package, and then it shows you and demonstrates all these things, and then you can run it and see how it works. So if you guys want to go through that process, please feel free. But folks, that covers chapter 3. So what happens next is we start building this stuff. So that's where it gets fun. All right, that wraps Chapter 3 lecture-wise.